All right, today we're going to talk about Unit 6, land descriptions. Land descriptions. Street addresses are the worst way in the world to find a property. I am not going to pick on anybody in here in the room because I don't think it happened. Normally it does. I get a call and somebody calls me up and they go, hey, I'm at 432 South Emerson. I can't find you. Where are you at? And I'm like, well, I'm standing right here. Where are you at? And they're like, well, I'm at 432 South Emerson. Are you close to the railroad track? Now, I've never been to 432 South Emerson, close to a railroad track, but I know there must be one now because everybody tells me that. And then I always hit them with, oh, are you in Greenwood? And they're like, ah, crap. I'm at 432 South Emerson in Indianapolis. All right? And then I mess with them. Is it Greenwood, or is that Indiana, or Greenwood, Ohio? So street addresses are the worst way to identify. All right, so we have to come up with this thing called a legal description, which describes the parcel. We're going to talk about all the different legal descriptions today and the different types there are, and we're going to talk about how to involve the measuring process to get those. The description is based on what they call a survey. A survey is completed to measure the boundaries of a property and the dimensions so that we know which property we're buying or selling or transferring. The U.S. courts have determined that surveys are sufficiently legal enough to identify the property. So when we deal with the actual sale, the title company will use a legal description. Typically, we still deal with the address, and we call the title company and go, hey, I need the title work on 432 South Emerson. Can you get the legal description? And they'll ask you all the pertinent questions. Greenwood, Indiana, 46143. Yes, they'll pull the legal description. So when we transfer the property, we transfer it based on legal description, not street address, because there's too many ways to mess it up. So what happened was they came up with this very first method. And there are three major methods to describe property. The first one is called the meets and bounds method. All right, sorry about the interruption. So meets and bounds becomes the first way to do this. Most of the first couple of states use the meets and bounds. Meets and bounds is a very easy description, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Meets and bounds. Meets means the directions, bounds means a distance. Up here on the board, and I've got videos for those of you at home, literally, you start at this place that they identify as what they call the point of beginning, or the POB. And they literally describe the distance and direction that bounds the property, hence the word meets and bounds. So it would be something like starting at the point of beginning, then east 200 feet to some monument. That monument can be a man-made monument like a stake that the surveyor drives in the ground. Or it can be some naturally occurring monument like the big oak tree. All right? So then you would go south 200 feet to some monument, then back west 200 feet to some monument, and then north 200 feet, and you have to end the meets and bounds with the words, and back to the point of beginning, so that it closes this shape, all right? So a description for this particular property would be starting at the point of beginning and traveling east 200 feet to the big oak tree, south 200 feet to the stake in the ground, west 200 feet to the other big oak tree, and then north 200 feet back to the point of beginning. That's a typical description. You have to end it with back to the point of beginning because you certainly don't want to end up with something like this, where where there is an unclosed kind of geometric shape. This will stop a closing quicker than anything because that's not a valid piece of property. Somewhere in there, so you end it with by saying, and back to the point of beginning. That way they know it terminates right back where you started. All right? Those monuments are nothing more than location corners, and they can be man-made or they can be naturally occurring. Now, the meets and bounds also has these two other distinctions inside of it that the other two do not. Meets and bounds allows you to use angles. So 15 degrees south by southwest. All right? It will allow you to use angles. You'll see in the others coming up, they're all built on the rectangular square. Okay? So the meets and bounds allows properties to have angles in their descriptions in case the property is irregularly shaped. The other thing the meets and bounds allows is this very generic and legally determined word that means more or less. It's more or less. For a science that is so precise, they use more or less. And you'll see how that plays out here in just a minute. What I want you to do in your book, look at figure 6.1. It's there on page 87. For those of you at home, it's on the screen. Let me read something to you, and I want you to follow along. It says, a tract of land located in Red Skull, Boone County, Virginia, described as the following. Beginning at the intersection of the east line on Jones Road and the south line of Skull Drive. There's our point of beginning. You can see where the point of beginning is. See it? East line of Jones and the south line, so it's on that corner where the stars mark point of beginning. Then east along the south line of Skull Drive for 200 feet. Then south 15 degrees east for 265 and a half feet, more or less, to the center thread of Red Skull Creek. Okay, time out. 216 and a half feet east, and it's going down at an angle south, more or less to the center thread of the creek. Why 216 and a half feet more or less? The creek could move, right? We could have accretion and erosion that could move the creek a little bit. So it's 216 and a half feet more or less to the center thread of the creek. So what kind of property rights does this owner getting? To the center thread of the creek. So it's non-navigable, and you know that because it's going to the center line, and it is treated like a river, so it's called what? Raptor. Riparian rights. He has riparian rights to a non-navigable river, which we call a creek, and they call it a creek, and we know that because it's to the center thread. If it would have been to like the Ohio River, it would have said to the banks. All right? So it says to the center thread. So you know he's got a non-navigable river, and B, it's riparian rights. All right, so let's go back. 16 and a half feet more or less to the center thread of the Red Skull Creek, then northwesterly along the center line of that creek to the intersection of the east line of Jones Road. Then north 105 feet more or less. Once again, that river could move right there. So it's back to 105 feet north, more or less. Could be 104.8, could be 105.1, but it's 105 feet more or less along the east line of the Jones Road and back to the point of beginning. That is a typical meets and bounds description for a piece of property. You can see the legal description for that piece of property that looks something like that. Notice it had an angle 15 degrees. All right. It also had the more or less because waters could shift. And we also got into it riparian rights. This is a typical great question on an exam. Notice it didn't even talk about that, but you needed to know what riparian meant, that it was the center thread of a creek. That's what I'm talking about. One of the questions on this exam may say something, something, something about the description, and then boom, now there's a question about water rights. What kind of water rights does this guy have? Well, crap, didn't even talk about it. Yes, it does, because you know riparian means river, and centerline means non-navigable. So that could be a question that you just had to know that, to actually know that other question. All right, that's what I'm talking about. Monuments are a fixed item. They are used to identify the corners and the POB. All right? And they typically now use a lot of man-made stuff. If you guys go out into the middle of the roads, first of all, check the traffic before you do that. Just want a disclaimer in case something happens. If you don't check the traffic before you go out in the middle of the road, you know what that's called? Thinning the herd. All right? Thinning the herd. No. You can usually see the tops to metal stakes that are driven or spikes into the ground. That would be a great example of a monument where a surveyor would have to find that, and he would then, say, and you've seen them do that, where they're setting the tripod and running the azimuth, and the other guy's standing down here like this. All right? That's what they're doing. So you can see those man-made spikes. They used to use a lot of naturally occurring stuff, and we're trying to go away from that. The old oak tree may not be there forever. If my aunt and uncle, my dad's aunt and uncle are from Little Rock, Arkansas, and all of their directions are like that. You go down to the Johnson's farm, turn left until you get to the Miller's hayfield, then go right, and I kid you not, that's how they used to tell us how to go places. Yeah, just going down past the Johnson's farm, it's right the first road on your left. Okay? Any questions about meets and bounds? The meets and bounds was cool because it was real easy, real simple. You just measure it and it worked. Right?